This is our bovine movie. I'll be doing muscles of the head, and we'll start with muscles of the face. So the orbicularis oculi originates from the nasal region of the frontal bone to the frontal process of the maxilla. It inserts on the skin of the orbital region, and it contracts to close the eye. The orbicularis oris originates from the medial aspect of the maxilla and mandible, and inserts on the skin and the mucous membrane of the lips. It functions to close the lip. The levator labii superioris originates between the nares and inserts on the upper lip, and its function is to pull the lip upwards. The levator nasolabialis originates above the eye and inserts on the nose and the angle of the lip, and it functions to contract and pull the nares and the edges of the lips laterally. The caninus originates on the maxilla and inserts from the region of the maxilla to the lateral aspect of the nares, and its function is to pull the nares and flare the nostrils. The zygomaticus originates from the epimysium of the masseter muscle and to the edge of the mouth, and inserts on the edge of the lips, and its function is to contract and pull the lips laterally. The buccinator originates from aspects of the maxilla and mandible and inserts between the maxilla and mandible, and its function is to move food between the teeth and the tongue. The masseter originates on the zygomatic arch and inserts on the lateral mandible, and it functions while it contracts, it closes the jaw, and when it relaxes, it opens the jaw. The pterygoides originates on the pterygoid bone and inserts on the medial mandible, and its function is to move the jaw side to side. The temporalis originates on the temporal fossa and inserts on the coronoid process of the mandible, and its function is closure of the jaw. The digastricus is caudal to the temporomandibular joint and inserts on the medial mandible, and its function is to push the jaw open. Now, these are muscles of the tongue. The mylohyoides originates between the two rami of the mandible and inserts on the mandible, and it forms the floor of the oral cavity. The genioglossus originates on the rostral mandible and inserts on the base of the tongue, and its function is to extend the tongue outwards. The hyoglossus originates on the hyoid apparatus and inserts on the base of the tongue. Its function is to retract the tongue into the oral cavity. Next, we have the nervous system. The central nervous system is comprised of the brain and the spinal cord. It is referred to as the central nervous system as it combines information from the body and the brain. The peripheral nervous system is comprised of nerves emerging from the spinal cord. The brachial plexus innervates the forelimb, while the lumbosacral plexus innervates the hind limb. The brain is comprised of the cerebrum, cerebellum, and the brainstem. The cerebellum is used for primitive actions, and the cerebrum functions for higher order thinking. There are three meninges surrounding the brain: the dura mater, which is the outermost layer, the arachnoid mater, which is the middle web-like layer, and the pia mater, which is the innermost layer closest to the brain. These meninges provide protection. And finally, the spinal cord is part of the central nervous system, and it carries messages between the brain and the rest of the body. The dorsal aspect of the spinal cord carries sensory information towards the brain, and the ventral aspect brings motor information from the brain towards the body.
Okay, so for my part of the bovine movie, I did the digestive and urinary system. So to start with the digestive system, we'll start at the oral portion. The prehensile organ of the cow is the tongue, and the dental formula is 00333133. So as you can see, there's a present of the dental pad, which is the area where there are no teeth. So you can see it right here, and along the hard palate, you can see there are raised portions called the palatine rugae, and the soft palate back here in the entire oral cavity. So the papillae on the tongue, the two papillae that have taste buds are valate and fungiform, while filiform and conical do not. Valate looks like it has a collar, fungiform looks like mushrooms, filiform looks like smooth projections, and conical looks like blunt projections. And these are all located along different areas of the tongue. The esophagus is lined by stratified squamous epithelium. It has two muscular layers, which are circular and longitudinal, to help move the bolus down the esophagus in peristalsis. And it's lined by skeletal muscle to allow the ruminant to regurgitate its food when it wants to, and it's adjacent to the trachea. The sulcus ruminoreticularis is a modification in calves that connects the esophagus directly to the abomasum, bypassing the rumen, reticulum, and omasum, so that milk doesn't get fermented. This opening of the groove is stimulated by the suckling reflex and milk protein, and it closes after 20 weeks of life. The abomasum is known as a true stomach, and it has a low pH due to the presence of HCl, and it has pepsin to break peptide bonds in proteins and pancreatic lipase to break down fats. It's the largest compartment in calves due to the sulcus ruminoreticularis as well. The rumen is the first part of the stomach, and it's the main site of fermentation. It has microbes that digest complex cellulose and hemicellulose, and the byproducts of fermentation are methane and carbon dioxide, which also must be released by rumen motility, which allows the byproducts to be burped out. It has papillae for nutrient absorption and is a compartment from which the cow regurgitates to chew their cud. The reticulum looks like a honeycomb, and it flows freely between the reticulum and the rumen, and it's also a site of fermentation and volatile fatty acid uptake. It collects smaller particles to move them from the rumen into the omasum, and the omasum is located in between the rumen and reticulum and abomasum. It has leaflets, kind of like a book, which is visible in the photo, and it's important for water absorption. The pylorus is a smooth muscle sphincter that separates the abomasum and the duodenum. And the duodenum is the first section of the small intestine. It receives secretions from the gallbladder and the pancreas and is lined with villi to increase the surface area for nutrient absorption. Cells in the intestines are held together through tight junctions, so that a lot of immune support is required through lymph nodes in case the barrier ever gets breached. And these cells are also, some of them are goblet cells to secrete mucus. So you can kind of see it in this diagram down here, what the villi look like. The pancreas is located within the duodenal loop and it has papillae that connect it to the duodenum. It has endocrine and exocrine functions. The exocrine functions are mainly for digestion, so it produces trypsin and chemotrypsin to break peptide bonds and pancreatic lipase to break down fatty acids and monoglycerides. The endocrine functions are producing insulin and glucagon from the islets of Langerhans. The liver is responsible for detoxification. It has sinusoids, so blood flows through the sinusoids to ensure that there's maximal contact with the hepatocytes so that detoxification can happen. So blood percolates towards the central vein while bile goes towards the bile duct. It's the first barrier to anything that flows out of the intestines and contains the gallbladder, which has materials essential for fat digestion. So the gallbladder secretes bile, which has bile salts, cholesterol, phospholipids, and bile pigments. And the cholecystokinin from the duodenum stimulates gallbladder contractions to release bile and digest that fat. The common bile duct is a tube that brings bile from the gallbladder through the pancreas and into the duodenum. And the main pancreatic duct, also known as the duct of Wirsung, is a tube that brings pancreatic secretions to bring them to the duodenum. The accessory pancreatic duct is formed when the dorsal and ventral pancreatic ducts combine, and a portion of the dorsal pancreatic duct is left. And it's basically just a non-functional tube that bypasses the ampulla of Vater. The ampulla of Vater is a junction between the common bile duct and the pancreatic duct, where they enter the duodenum. And the sphincter of Oddi is a smooth muscle sphincter located at the junction of the common bile duct and the pancreatic duct and the duodenum. It's typically closed, but it opens when the exocrine pancreas and the bile duct juices are produced to digest food. The jejunum is the second section of the small intestine, and this is where nutrient absorption for any nutrients that weren't absorbed by the duodenum occurs. The ileum is the third and last section of the small intestine. There's further nutrient absorption and preparation to move food content to the large intestine, and it has a valve at the end to prevent backward flow from the large intestine. So all of the small intestines are lined by these villi. The cecum is located at the junction between the small and large intestines, and it's a location where undigested fiber is broken down, and it has protruding sebaceous gland-like components. The colon is a site within the large intestine, and its main function is water reabsorption, and has some microbes that reuptake the last few nutrients. The rectum is the final section of the large intestine, which leads to the anus, and it stores waste until the cow is ready to expel it through the anus. The peritoneum is a serous membrane that lines the abdominal cavity and surrounds abdominal organs, and it developed from the mesoderm. Now moving on to the urinary system. The kidney of the cow is multilobar, and the functional unit of the kidney is the nephron. So you can kind of see the lobar structure in these few diagrams and photos. So the cortex is the outer portion of the kidneys. It includes the afferent arterioles, glomerulus, Bowman's capsule, proximal convoluted tubule, distal convoluted tubule, and collecting ducts. So this is also the location of glomerular filtration of the glomerulus, tubular reabsorption of nutrients by the proximal convoluted tubule, in which it reabsorbs 100% of glucose amino acids, 85% of bicarbonate ions, 70% of sodium chloride, and NaCl and water reuptake by the distal convoluted tubule, as well as the location of the collecting duct. The medulla is the inner layer of the kidney and includes a loop of Henle and the countercurrent mechanism with the vasa recta. So the descending loop of Henle encounters a hypertonic environment, it releases water, which then gets absorbed by the vasa recta, which is flowing in the opposite direction. And the ascending loop of Henle releases NaCl ions, which also get absorbed by the vasa recta. So it also has the collecting duct to lead it down. The renal pyramid is a triangular portion of the kidney that contains sections of the renal medulla, and the collecting ducts join together from each pyramid to reach the renal pelvis. Although this kidney right here is unilobar, this structure is pretty analogous among species. Lobes each consist of a renal pyramid and a renal cortex, and for the major and minor calyxes collect urine from each renal pyramid, and the minor calyxes all join together to form a major calyx, and so urine flows through the major calyx into the renal pelvis. The pelvis is where all the collecting ducts lead, and it's lined by transitional epithelium so it can get distended with urine, and it excretes urine into the ureter. The ureter also has transitional epithelium and is a tube that carries urine from the kidney in the renal pelvis to the urinary bladder, and there's one for each kidney. The urinary bladder is lined by transitional epithelium, and it can expand when it's filled with urine, which is when the wall becomes distended, the cells become flat. When distended, there's reflex activation for smooth muscle contraction to do micturition, which is the emptying of the urinary bladder. It's innervated by sacral parasympathetic nerves to promote micturition, and lumbar sympathetic nerves, which suppress micturition, and reflex micturition can be prevented by control of the hemiurethralis muscle.
Reproductive system. Bulls have a fibroelastic penis with a sigmoid flexure, giving it an S shape when flaccid. Glans penis and the urethral process form the head of the penis. This is where the ejaculation occurs. The scrotum is a two-lobe sac that houses the testes externally via a connection by the spermatocord. Right here, you can see the two lobes, one here, one here. The testes are connected to the scrotum by the gubernaculum. And the tunica dardos regulates the temperature by contracting when it's cold and relaxing when it's hot. The sigmoid flexure of the penis results from being flaccid and the contraction of the retractor penis muscle. Here's the sigmoid flexure, shaped like an S, and here's the retractor penis muscle. When an erection occurs, the retractor penis muscle relaxes. The retractor penis muscle is smooth muscle, and it also forms the shaft of the penis, which is this whole thing right here. The crust penis houses the blood vessels needed for erection and fuse together to form the corpus cavernosum. That's right here. The ischiocavernosum muscle work with the crust penis by contracting to force blood through the crust penis needed for an erection. That's this muscle right here. The bulbospongiosus contracts to move blood to build pressure in order to expel semen from the urethra during ejaculation. That muscle is up here. It's in the middle of the ischiocavernosum. The urethralis contracts to release seminal fluid, which is a fluid that transports and nourishes sperm that comes from the vesicular glands during ejaculation. Here's the vesicular gland. Here's the urethralis muscle. All three muscles are skeletal muscle. And the body prostate, this little thing right here, also produces seminal fluid. The testes contain seminiferous tubules, which is where spermatogenesis occurs. They look like this inside of the testes. The testes are surrounded by a membrane-like organ called the epididymis. Epididymis starts down here, and it would encapsulate the whole. It's here where the sperm is stored and matured. The testes and the epididymis are suspended by the spermatocord. The spermatocord is up here. The cremaster muscle surrounds the spermatocord, and when contracted, the testes are pulled into the body. The pampiniform plexus is a passageway for veins and arteries that is inside the cremaster muscle. The ductus deferens are the cords that connect the testes to the urethra and are responsible for transporting sperm all the way through ejaculation. Those are up here, the ductus deferens. Now we move on to the additional content. The patella is a sesamoid bone in that it is a small bone encapsulated by a joint. The patella is going to be located right up here, the kneecap. The stifle joint is a ginglymus joint that is located on the bovine hind limb that connects the femur and the tibia and fibula. And they articulate here in the center, otherwise known as a hinge joint. It has extracapsular ligaments and menisci that cushion the movement between the bones. Here's the extracapsular ligaments. The menisci are down here, cushioning. A synsarcosis joint is a type of connection between bones that is solely muscle. The trapezius is an example as it joins the scapula to the ligaments of the dorsal midline. This provides structure to the forelimb by joining it to the body. The trapezius is right here. And the scapula would be here. The spleen is an organ that stores and removes red blood cells from circulation. The spleen is an organ that stores and removes blood cells from circulation, essentially managing the blood cells. The spleen is also involved in antigen surveillance and antibody production in the immune system.
Today I will be talking about the circulatory system as part of our bovine movie. The pericardium is a thick double layer surrounding the heart and helps hold the heart in place. Next is the apex. The apex is the tip of the heart and can be identified because it points out. There are 4 chambers of the heart, the right and left atria and the right and left ventricles. The right atria receives deoxygenated blood from the systemic veins, and the left atrium receives deoxygenated blood from the pulmonary veins. The left and right ventricles of the heart are the lower chambers. The right ventricle receives oxygen-poor blood from the right atrium and pumps blood through the pulmonary valve to the lungs. The left ventricle pumps oxygen-rich blood through the aortic valve and out to the rest of the body. The septum acts as a wall that separates the right and left sides of the heart. The papillary muscle plays a critical role in valve contractions and pulls the valve open to allow blood flow. The chordae tendineae regulates the closure of the atrioventricle valve during systole. The bicuspid valve is located in the left atrium and regulates the blood flow from the left ventricle into the aorta and prevents blood from flowing back. The tricuspid valve function is to allow blood flowing into the heart from the body to flow to the right ventricle where it is pumped to the lungs. Semilunar valves are the aortic valve and pulmonary valve. Their main function is to prevent blood from flowing back. Like the rest of the body, the heart needs oxygen-rich blood to function. This is where the coronary arteries are needed because they supply blood to the heart. The aortic arch is a segment of the aorta that helps distribute blood to the head and upper portion of the body. The ligamentum arteriosum is the embryonic remnant of the ductus arteriosus. The cranial vena cava transports all the blood from the upper portion of the body to the right atrium of the heart, while the caudal vena cava transports blood from all the other portions of the body to the right atrium. For example, blood flowing from the head is transported through the cranial vena cava, while blood flowing from the liver is being transported through the caudal vena cava. The pulmonary trunk is known as a pulmonary artery. Its function is to transport blood moving from the right ventricle to the lungs. Mesenteric arteries provide oxygenated blood and nutrients to the intestines. There are different parts of fetal circulation that deteriorate as a bovine becomes an adult and are replaced. During fetal circulation, there are certain aspects that are not needed like there is in adult circulation. One of these structures is the foramen O valve. The foramen O valve allows blood flow to pass the fetal lungs. Because the fetus is being supplied oxygen-rich blood from the mom, the fetal lungs are not needed to oxygenate the blood. The ductus arteriosus is a fetal artery connecting the aorta and the pulmonary artery. It allows blood to bypass the lungs before birth. The ductus venosus connects the umbilical vein and carries oxygenated blood to the vena cava, bypassing the liver. The umbilical artery carries deoxygenated blood toward the placenta, and the umbilical vein carries newly oxygenated and nutrient-rich blood back to the fetus. Next, I will be talking about the endocrine system. The pituitary gland is located beneath the hypothalamus and regulates metabolism and production through hormones. There are two parts of the pituitary, the anterior and the posterior. The anterior secretes LH and FSH, while the posterior secretes oxytocin. LH is crucial for gonadal functions, and FSH stimulates follicular growth and ovulation. Oxytocin stimulates muscle contractions for birth and is involved in a positive feedback loop with milk, letdown, and contractions during parturition. Next, there's the thymus. The thymus is located above the heart and is crucial for the immune system in the bovine. The thymus provides defense mechanisms that protect against pathogens, tumors, antigens, and tissue damage. The adrenal gland is located on top of the kidney. It has an outer region called the cortex and an inner region called the medulla. Production of the cortisol and aldosterone are derived from the cortex. The main adrenal medulla hormones are epinephrine and norepinephrine, which augments sympathetic response to stress by actions on several organs. The pancreas is located above the duodenum and has exocrine and endocrine functions. The endocrine functions of the pancreas regulate insulin and glucagon levels. The pancreas has islets of Langerhans, beta cells, and alpha cells. Beta cells regulate insulin, and alpha cells regulate glucagon. Glucagon stimulates gluconeogenesis in the liver and releases glucose. Insulin lowers blood glucose by stimulating uptake by skeletal muscles. For example, an increase in blood glucose stimulates insulin secretion, and decrease in blood glucose stimulates glucagon secretion. Finally, there are the ovaries and testes. These are the gonads and perform endocrine functions. The testes have Leydig cells and Sertoli cells. In the Leydig cells, LH stimulates Leydig cells to produce androgens, and FH stimulates Sertoli cells to cause spermatogenesis to occur. Within the ovaries, theca, granulosa, and corpus luteum are involved in endocrine functions. LH stimulates theca cells to produce androgen, and FSH stimulates granulosa cells to convert androgens to estrogens. Finally, the corpus luteum produces progesterones and relaxin, but only in some.
This section looks at muscles of the body, which include the abdomen, forelimb, and pelvic limb. The abdomen consists of four muscles: the transversus abdominis, external and internal abdominal obliques, and rectus abdominis. The transversus abdominis originates from the deep thoracolumbar fascia, caudal ribs, and lumbar vertebrae. It inserts into the linea alba and acts as connective tissue, which helps to stabilize the spine and support the trunk. The external abdominal oblique originates from the last few ribs of the thoracolumbar fascia and inserts into the linea alba, rim of the pelvis, and tuber coccyx. Its function is to help form the inguinal canal. The internal abdominal oblique originates from the tuber coccyx and transverse processes of the lumbar. Its insertion points include the linea alba, caudal ribs, and rim of the pelvis, and its function is to also help form the inguinal canal. The rectus abdominis originates from the costal cartilage and sternum and inserts into the pubis via the prepubic tendon. Its function is to flex the trunk. Moving on to muscles of the forelimb. The trapezius muscle originates from the ligamentum nuchae and ligaments of the dorsal midline. It inserts into the scapular spine and helps move the scapula. These movements include lifting, advancing, and retracting. The rhomboideus muscle has the same origin points as the trapezius, but it inserts into the medial side of the scapular cartilage. Its function is to also help to move the scapula, but also to lift the neck. The supraspinatus muscle originates from the supraspinous fossa of the scapula, inserts into the greater tubercle of the humerus, and helps to stabilize and extend the shoulder. The infraspinatus muscle originates from the infraspinous fossa of the scapula, inserts into the greater tubercle of the humerus, and helps to stabilize and flex the shoulder. The ridge separating the supraspinatus and infraspinatus muscles is known as the spine of the scapula. The subscapularis originates from the subscapular fossa and inserts into the medial humerus. Its function is to also help stabilize the shoulder. The biceps brachii originates from the supraglenoid tubercle scapula and inserts into the cranial aspect of the proximal radius and ulna. It flexes the elbow and extends the shoulder. The triceps brachii originates from the caudal border of the scapula and proximal humerus. It inserts into the olecranon process of the ulna and helps to extend the elbow and flex the shoulder. Since the biceps brachii and triceps brachii perform opposite actions, they are known as antagonistic muscles. The latissimus dorsi originates from the spinous processes of the thoracic and lumbar vertebrae, inserting into the medial humerus. Its function includes retracting the limb and advancing the trunk. The serratus ventralis originates from the transverse processes of the caudal, cervical, and cranial thoracic vertebrae, as well as the first 8 to 9 ribs. It inserts into the medial scapula and scapular cartilage and helps to support the trunk, lift the neck, and advance and retract the scapula. There are two pectoralis muscles found in the forelimb. The pectoralis major is superficialis and pectoralis minor, or profundus. These two muscles share the same origin, insertion, and function. They originate from the cranial sternum and costal cartilages and ribs. They insert into the craniomedial humerus, and their function is to abduct the limb. There are two pectoralis muscles found in the forelimb. The pectoralis major is superficialis and pectoralis minor, or profundus. These two muscles share the same origin, insertion, and function. They originate from the cranial sternum and costal cartilages and ribs. They insert into the craniomedial humerus, and their function is to abduct the limb. Lastly, muscles of the pelvic limb. The gluteus medius originates from the wing of the ilium, tubercoxae, sacrum, and sacrosciatic ligament. It inserts into the greater trochanter of the femur, allowing for extension of the hip. The tensor fasciae lata originates from the tubercoxae and inserts into the fascia lata. Its function is to extend the stifle and flex the hip. The quadriceps femoris originates from the proximal femur and body of the ilium. It inserts into the patella, and its function is also to extend the stifle and flex the hip. The biceps femoris originate from the sacrum, sacrosciatic ligament, and ischial tuber. Its insertion is at the patellar ligament, patella, and calcaneal tuber. The more cranial aspect of the biceps femoris extends the hip and stifle, while its more caudal aspect flexes the stifle and extends the hock. The gastrocnemius originates at the caudal aspect of the femoral condyles and inserts into the tuber calcaneus. Its function is to extend the hock. The submembranosus originates from the caudal vertebrae, sacrosciatic ligament, and ischial tuber. It inserts into the medial distal femur, medial proximal tibia, and fascia lata. Its function includes extending the hip, stifle, and hock. The semitendinosus originates from the sacrum, caudal vertebrae, sacrosciatic ligament, and ischial tuber. It inserts into the cranial tibia and calcaneal tuber. Its function is the same of extending the hip, stifle, and hock.
This is the respiratory system and muscles of respiration by Jennifer Griffin. The pharynx is the membrane-lined cavity behind the nose and mouth. It's made of stratified squamous epithelium. It leads to the larynx and eventually the esophagus and trachea. The larynx protects the entrance to the trachea, and because it's the organ of phonation, many call it the voice box. The larynx is made up of 5 different cartilages in most domestic animals. The hyoid apparatus is above the larynx and consists of the bones that suspend the tongue and larynx. It consists of pairs of stylohyoid, thyrohyoid, epihyoid, and ceratohyoid bones, and a single basihyoid bone. The epiglottic cartilage in the larynx is mostly elastic cartilage, and it's made to fold over itself to close the opening of the larynx during food consumption. This ensures that no food enters the lungs. The thyroid cartilages articulate with other cartilages and are attached to muscles that move the larynx. The shape of the arytenoid cartilages vary between species and are attached to the vocal ligaments. Movement of these cartilages accounts for change in pitch of voice. The cricoid cartilage is shaped like a ring and articulates with the thyroid and arytenoid cartilages. The glottis is an opening on the floor of the pharynx that controls airflow into the larynx. And lastly, the vestibule is a space between vocal ligaments. The trachea extends from the larynx to the bronchi. It consists of pseudostratified epithelium, and it's formed by tracheal rings that are made of hyaline cartilage. These rings attach to the trachealis muscle to form a C shape. The trachealis is a smooth muscle responsible for changing the diameter of the trachea. The tracheal rings are connected by annular ligaments, which allow for flexibility of the trachea. The trachea then turns into principal bronchi, one for each lung. The carina is the point at which the 2 bronchi diverge. The principal bronchi then divide into the secondary bronchi, tertiary bronchi, respiratory bronchioles, alveolar ducts, and finally the alveoli. Alveoli are where the final gas exchange occurs. The diaphragm is the most primary muscle of respiration. When it contracts, the volume of the thoracic cavity increases. This creates negative pressure, allowing air to rush in. The esophageal hiatus is an opening in the diaphragm that lets in the esophagus and vagus nerve. The aortic hiatus is an opening in the lower diaphragm that allows the aorta to pass through. The vena cava foramen is an opening in the diaphragm that allows for the inferior vena cava to pass through. The lungs are the primary organ of respiration for mammals, and they're where gas exchange occurs. Lungs are lined by membranes called pleura. The parietal pleura lines the thorax, and the visceral pleura lines the lungs. Most domestic mammals have 4 lobes in their right lung, except for the horse, which has 3. The apical lobe is located at the apex of the lung, while the cardiac lobe is named due to its proximity to the heart. The diaphragmatic lobe is caudal to the rest of the lung, and the accessory lobe is located near the midline. The left lung is typically smaller than the right, and all domestic mammals have only 2 lobes in their left lung. The cranial lobe is at the apex of the lung, and the caudal lobe is below it. The intercostal muscles are located between the ribs of domestic mammals. They aid in ventilation of the lungs, especially when the animal is undergoing increased respiration. Internal intercostal muscles run cradioventrally, and external intercostal muscles run caudoventrally. And this is the works cited.